Hey folks, welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner. I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Rockter, and today we are going to continue our journey through R.A. Lafferty's Past Master, his debut novel from 1968. This will be part one of two of a chapter-by-chapter outline. We're going to do 1 through 6 in this video, and then 7 through 13 in the next video. I've also made a video in response to a few new Lafferty videos here on YouTube, one of which, Liminal Spaces, tagged me, and one of which is about Lafferty's Past Master. I'll talk more about that at the end and do other housekeeping, talk about Patreon and stuff. But for now, let's bang into this. I chose to split these in half because I think going through all 13 chapters of this novel in one video, even trying to be brief, is maybe a bit much for me as well as for you, the viewer. So we'll just do 1 through 6 here. And so here I'm not going to give you any kind of plot outline or anything else. We're going to actually just get into these chapters. If you want to see discussion around what the novel's all about in terms of plot and texture and different things, you can look at the 2 previous videos on that riff off of some things that writers and reviewers said closer to the time of its publication. So, chapter 1, At the 25th Hour. This chapter sets up the whole novel. It sets out, kind of deceptively, basically the plot and themes of the novel. And I say deceptively because it will follow through, more or less, on everything it sets up here, but it's just going to do so much more. And the structure of this chapter is actually quite simple. It's a conversation between 3 powerful men who kind of rule Astrobe. It's sort of an oligarchy maybe, and they are trying to decide on who they're going to choose for the next world president. And it's set out right from the beginning that as they're having this discussion, they're in a building that is being besieged by these mechanical killers, as the novel calls them, who are basically in like a berserker frenzy, trying to get in the building and kill one of these 3 men who seems to be having thoughts that go against the utopian dream, the golden dream of Astrobe, as this novel puts it. And the nature of this utopia is such that people's minds are accessible to everyone else, including these mechanical killers who can detect when you are having unutopian thoughts, or really anti-utopian thoughts, actually. And they will set out to kill you for this. And this is not the kind of novel that's going to get into world building detail about that. It's just going to bang in, this is the scenario, on we go. We've got other things to do and other things to say. And through their conversation, they decide that there's no one in the present of either Astrobe or Earth that can fulfill this role because they're in a mode of crisis where the utopia is not working for various reasons, and they need a sort of figurehead, kind of a puppet president that they think will somehow right the ship. And since time travel has become an option, I think it says kind of recently, though again, this is not about time travel or getting into much about that. But since this is so, they're going to go back in time and select somebody. And they decide upon Thomas More, who authored Utopia, the book Utopia, back in the 16th century. And having decided upon that, the mechanical killers do break in, but the men evade them, and that's the end of that chapter. Now, despite that simplicity of structure, there is already a fair bit of depth and layering going on in this chapter. And from everything I've ever seen from, various reviewers and readers, people seem to love this opening chapter. And I've always been a little more iffy on it. It's got a lot of good things in it, but I have sometimes wished that it would start with the second chapter where I think the action gets going, though I realize there's reasons why that probably couldn't happen. You probably, if you've ever heard of the textual history of the Book of the New Sun, famously the first book, The Shadow of the Torturer, what is now its first chapter was originally its second chapter, and vice versa. And it's a pretty good switch that the editor suggested there, and works well with the novel. Whereas that could almost work with this one, but you would to then go back and do what the first chapter does would actually slow things down too much, I think. But at any rate, within the first couple of paragraphs here, this actually has one of my favorite sentences in the book. Speaking of these 3 powerful men, it says, "There was a peculiar linkage between them. Each believed that he controlled the other 2, that he was the puppeteer and they were the puppets. and each was partly right in this belief. It made them an interlocking nexus, taut and resilient, the most intricate on Astrobe. And I just have always loved that sentence with the interlocking nexus, taut and resilient. And then it goes on to do one of my other favorite moments directly after this, naming out the three powerful men. Cosmos Kingmaker, who was too rich, the heraldic lion. Peter Proctor, who was too lucky, the sleek fox. Fabian Foreman, who was too smart, the worried hawk. And so it sets out these almost totems of each of these figures that will then be picked up throughout the rest of the novel in interesting ways and developed and used. And even in this chapter, they will now act and speak like each of these almost heraldic symbols that they have been assigned. So Cosmos Kingmaker speaks in sort of a leonine way, Peter Proctor in a vulpine way, and Fabian Foreman in an aquiline or falconiform way, if you like. Though Foreman of the three is less clearly tied, sort of evocatively, to that animal than the other two are, a little more clearly. And so as an example with Cosmos Kingmaker, it says of him, even when he spoke quietly, Kingmaker was imposing. He had the head that should be on gold coins or on great seals. They called him the lion, but there were no lions on Astrobe except as statuary. He was a carven lion, cut out of the golden travertine, the fine yellow marble of Astrobe. He had a voice of such depth that it set up echoes even when he whispered. It was part of the aura of power that he set up about himself. And as I say, he proceeds to kind of talk in this rumble and with a cadence that would, if you imagine, would be the cadence of a carven lion. And with Fabian Foreman, it talks about him growling softly here and there, but a line I really love, which also hints at other aspects to Proctor that are barely hidden, but will come out more fully later in the novel. So it says of Peter Proctor, he was a sleek and pleasant man even when he took exception. His voice was a sort of mechanical purr, or was that of a fox that has been eating honey. What a great line. A voice like a fox who has been eating honey. To me, that has always evoked like a real voice that you can kind of imagine and a character behind it. And that's the kind of like sort of sudden flash of characterization that Lafferty does, and only does extremely sparingly. And then as these things are referenced again and again, that's the way it reinforces the filling out of this character. And indeed on rereads, these things fill in yet more. And I've always noticed a really strange little resonance between a moment in Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun, where it talks about, I think it's Dr. Talos, having the face of a fox or a fox-like mask at one moment, which is a little standout kind of eerie or weird moment in the Book of the New Sun, which has lots of those, but it's one of those standout moments in that. And I've always felt a slight resonance over here with Peter Proctor and his fox-like qualities. And, you know, Past Master came out first, and that was one of the things that a guy called Virgil over at Literally Books was noticing when he read Past Master, that he felt it was a pretty strong influence, or Lafferty's whole style was a pretty strong influence on Wolfe. And you got to wonder, is there even just tiny little like direct influences, maybe even more subconsciously to Wolfe, where the idea of this fox-like character stuck with him and came out in one of his own characters. And there need be no direct established causal link between the two to feel that nice resonance. And as I say, there doesn't seem to be a little moment of prose that does something similar with Fabian Foreman as the worried hawk, but he does carry almost maternal avine worrying in his speech and point of view. And this opening chapter sets up some tonal things as well, because it does immediately give you a sense of the action and the violence that's going to be involved, that's going to pepper and punctuate the novel, as well as the long conversations and disquisitions that are also going to punctuate and pepper the novel, and indeed how they kind of interact in odd ways, and that there is a raucous roughhouse humor about the whole thing, whilst being like sort of genuinely violent and also, you know, philosophically serious at the same time. And this chapter has always kind of struck me as like that moment in a film where the digital countdown to a bomb, you know, a MacGruber moment, is counting down, and the things that characters are saying between themselves, or the time they're taking to dismantle the bomb, or other things that are happening, are clearly like way too much, would take way too much time versus the amount of seconds left on that clock. And it feels like this. And also their attitude toward this, like, it just keeps describing there's so much noise from this, but they're like, you know, just carrying on with their conversation and vaguely acknowledging that it's noisy, but like on they go, and they're not too concerned about it. And I talked a little bit more about this in regard to Virgil at Literally Books' review of Past Master, and how that kind of quality to the novel struck him as quite strange, and he tries to analyze it a little bit, and it's very interesting. But we'll talk more about what I think works and doesn't work as well in this opening chapter, and just more generally some cool stuff it does and says, and what it sets up when we go through doing videos on each chapter. But one important thing they do here is they argue about their own motives for getting Thomas More or a New World president at all, and it fits with each character's distinctive point of view and motivations. Cosmos Kingmaker wants a sort of figurehead that will kind of, in a way, like resell the people on Utopia, whereas Peter Proctor also wants something of a figurehead, but he thinks everything's going great with Utopia, and this figurehead can keep the status quo, I guess. We'll try to untangle this a little more. And Fabian Foreman seems to have a little bit more noble motive in wanting a good man, he says. Like Cosmos says, I want a great man, and Foreman's like, I want a good man. And by good, he simply means to at least have one moment of honesty in his life, and that's why he selects Thomas More, because of More's opposition to the king at the cost of his own life in actual history. But let me just read one last thing from this chapter. It's always been one of my favorite parts. Toward the end of it, where Cosmos asks Foreman, have you a list, Foreman? Yes. Foreman took a folded paper from his pocket. He made a great show of unfolding it and smoothing it out. He cleared his throat. Thomas More, he read. He folded the paper again and put it back in his pocket. That's right, he said. Only one name on my list. He had one completely honest moment right at the end. I can't think of anyone else who ever had one. But it never fails to make me actually laugh out loud in that moment when he ceremoniously unfolds and refolds this piece of paper with the one name on it. I don't know. It's just a silly little joke. You know, and Lafferty has lots of goofy jokes like that, but I think it's hilarious. Though I find their dialogue a little on the longish end in terms of sort of pacing and symmetry and stuff, nevertheless, this opening chapter is rather short. So, you know, it kind of sets up what it needs to set up and moves on, which is good, I think. I just remembered, I do want to mention one other thing about this opening chapter. It does give you a strong flavor of the appearance and attitude or vibe of these mechanical killers. And one thing that Matt from Bookpilt said when he reviewed Past Masters a little while ago was that these mechanical killers were almost like Terminators. And I had never quite thought of that. And that's pretty accurate, except that add a vibe of like rage zombie to these guys, because they are like ravenous, it says, for the blood of anyone who would betray the utopian dream. And they tend to come in this sort of rabid melee of onslaught after anyone they're after. And it describes them as almost having like a joy or glee in their bloodlust. So really, I think something a little fresh in the idea of like killer robots going on there. I mean, as it says of the mechanical killers right at the beginning of the novel, there was a clattering thunder in the street outside, but the sun was shining. It was the clashing thunder of the mechanical killers, ravening and raging. They shook the building and were on the verge of pulling it down. They required the life and the blood of one of the three men, and they required it immediately, now, within the hour, within the minute. So you get a sense of their sort of raving urgency. And later it says that you could hear the hate roaring of the things underfoot now. These things are livid and lethal. And as far as I can remember, this novel never once uses the word robot, and I don't think it uses the word android either. And it does make this distinction between programmed persons and programmed killers, who are also called mechanical killers. And I think sometimes the programmed persons are also called mechanical men, who both seem to be a form of AI, but it's almost like there's this citizen class and a military class maybe of AI, or police force of AI. And here's one of the only physical descriptions we get of these mechanical killers in the novel that's meant to sort of carry us the rest of the way through. And it's quite concrete and suggestive, but also plenty open and ambiguous enough to let our imagination play with what they might look like. There was a rending crash rising above the ocean of noise, and one of the mechanical killers splintered the upper part of an interior door to the room and came through it, head and thorax. It contorted its ogre face and gathered to heave itself through. Then came something almost too swift to follow. With a blindingly swift flick of a hand knife, Proctor struck the killer where the thorax emerges from the lorica. He killed it or demobilized it. Proctor often showed this incredible speed of motion which seemed beyond the human. The mechanical killer dangled there, the upper part of him through the broken door. The thing had a purplish, nightmarish ogre appearance designed to affright. And so he uses these terms like thorax and lorica that could describe any anatomy and any piece of armor, but have a strange feel to them. I don't know what other readers think, but always has struck me as something of the animal and or even insectile. But then we're told quite clearly there's something purplish, nightmarish, an ogre quality to the face, and that it is meant to be scary. So it's kind of cool in that way. And that's kind of the only time I think it describes actual appearance. The rest of the time it describes actions and attitudes that totally add to this. And you're just meant to keep that in mind, I guess. And I would love to see more artists take this up and get different interpretations of what this might look like. There's been this tendency on book covers to show these things as either cats or dogs, like big cats, like lions or something, and dogs, because I think it gets mixed up with some other things in the novel, like the Lazarus lions and Portia's panthers, which are actual animals. And also, because metaphorically after this moment, Lafferty refers to them quite a number of times as dogs and or cats, or as like hound cats. And it seems to me quite clear if you look at the various times that's brought up, it is always a metaphor that they behave like hounds on the scent or killer big cats. You know, they're predatory in that way. They're predacious. In a way, I don't mind those covers having that because they're really fun. And that is actually how it feels, even though I think it's not literally that way. That's another way in which Lafferty can be a bit like an animated cartoon in an exciting way, that it just kind of sends those kinds of images into your head. But I'd still love to see somebody be a little more pedantic and like draw it as it's actually described without metaphors. Well, using the metaphors maybe for part of how it looks, maybe in motion. But I do think these are anthropoid figures, but let me know what you think. And actually, just let me point out one more thing about this chapter before we move on, and that's that when they're talking about sort of what they're trying to do here in saving utopia or what have you, Foreman's perspective, as he puts it, and this is why the mechanical killers are after him, he says, "I want a death and resurrection of the thing, and the mechanical killers do not understand this." And by the thing, he means the utopian thing, the golden dream of Astrobe. He does actually want it to die, but for the purposes of being reborn, resurrecting anew, I guess, made right. And he mentions this coming about through a mustard seed, which is a biblical reference about tiny things becoming large things, the kingdom of heaven, I believe, in the New Testament. And that whole idea is going to be picked up in the novel in a couple of important places and in the end, or developed. But because he wants it to go through a process of death, that's seen as a threat. And so he is, even though these three, they say they're supposed to be sacrosanct, they are sort of the architects of utopia. How could they ever be suspect? But because of what he wants this to undergo in order to reach its fruition as utopia, he's perceived as against it and in need of termination. But as I say, just a lot of very important things are like set up and will be followed through right through to the end of the novel in this opening chapter. And I think sometimes readers lose sight of how that's followed through in the rest of the novel because then it gets jam-packed with a host of other wild stuff. So let's move on to that. So chapter 2, My Grave and I in It. So despite the presence of the mechanical killers in that first chapter and a little bit of action, as you saw, he like dispatched that mechanical killer with a knife. Everybody's really handy with knives in this novel. But despite those little moments of action, I felt that chapter leaned very, very heavily on dialogue, conversation. And to me, in a kind of a stark contrast, this chapter just gets going with sort of rip-roaring space adventure. It's so fun. Although it already begins to show the sort of variegated quality of this novel, because its basic structure is you start off with this sort of futuristic action bit, then you move into this really trippy space travel, and then you go to very brief time travel and kind of a little historical fiction setting that's pretty nicely realized in a simple, compact way. And then kind of back through that sequence in reverse. Trippy space travel, back through to action again, like brawling action, although that actually starts at the beginning of chapter 3, but it completes that arc back again. So as Fabian Foreman goes to summon this outlaw that he thinks is the best man to get this job done, we are introduced to a central character called simply Paul, who has no surname because of his irregular doings, and in this society you're stripped of your surname if you are not lawful. And Paul also has thoughts against the utopian dream, so he has been on the run from the mechanical killers for some time. It says that he's evaded them for a whole year now, which is considered a very long time to actually keep out of reach of these very effective killers. I suppose you've got a bit of John Wick vibes going on here. Again, with Paul, we get a sort of quick visual and character description that is meant to sit there in place and do the work for the rest of the novel, with little additions and things that he says and does that add to his character. And then, as I say, this becomes more concrete on rereads as well. And as I've been saying for a while now, I feel that Lafferty puts these sort of fictional tokens in place, and they really do work, and they stick in your mind vividly and stuff. He just doesn't approach it like a normal writer would. And right toward the beginning of the chapter, I love this description of Paul. Paul was 2 meters of walking irony, a long, strong, swift man and short of speech. His voice was much softer than would be expected from his appearance, and had only a slight rough edge to it. What seemed to be a perpetual crooked grin was partly the scar of an old fight. He was a compassionate man with a cruel and crooked face. From his height, his rough red hair and ruddy face, and his glittering eyes, he was sometimes called the Beacon. And I don't know, I haven't read Zelazny in such a long time, but I remember getting strong Zelazny vibes when I read this. Like, this sounds kind of like one of Zelazny's protagonists to me, or something along those lines. And it's really fun to see Lafferty do that. And he does that here and there in various ways, but Paul's somewhat unique in his output in that way. And Paul says of himself later to Foreman, "I'm a competent pilot in both mediums, time and space." And so altogether it sets up that he is as Judith Merrill puts it, an outlaw astronaut. And once Foreman and Paul have chatted for a moment, the action just kicks in. And it's just so cool. Like he kind of jams this sort of identification thing on Foreman's little craft. And Foreman thinks, oh no, I've picked the wrong guy. This guy's a blundering idiot. But it's all part of Paul's quick thinking plan. And he basically intentionally gets himself caught between 2 sort of policing forces, because this little craft of Foreman's is now reported as stolen. And so there are these spaceport guards that are going to try to apprehend him because he's taking the small craft to a larger actual spacecraft to take off toward Earth. And then, of course, the mechanical killers are always after him. And he's hoping by getting between both of them, they'll crash into each other and he can get away. And this is where he likens the spaceport guards and their sort of large, lumbering exoskeletons or, Gundam suits or something. I'm not entirely sure. And then these swift, lithe, lethal mechanical killers. And he calls the spaceport guards bears, and initially he calls the mechanical killers hounds here. And he's trying to get between the bears and the hounds so he can slip through. And eventually he's calling the mechanical killers hound cats, I guess to convey their feline and canine qualities. And you do just kind of picture these things literally as being sort of bears and hound cats of some mechanical variety. And it's like this cool anime vibe or something. It's rad. And it's like really quickly violent. They're like grappling him or something and tearing chunks of his flesh out and stuff. And he's also planned for this ahead of time too. He's telepathically communicating with one of the native species of the planet, the Ansels, Ansels. And the one character we hear from throughout the whole time, Rimrock, so that he has allies, some really rough guys from some of the slum cities who are going to jump into this melee as well and battle these mechanical things whilst Paul's trying to get away. And weird little things happen in there where somebody stabs a machine and it turns out there's a person inside. And I don't know that that's ever even fully explained, but we get introduced to some of the recurring characters who will be a sort of retinue around Thomas More eventually. Rimrock and Walter Copperhead the Necromancer. These tough characters from Cathead, that's the name of the slum, Battersea and Shanty and these sorts of things. And Walter Copperhead can almost like magic the mechanical killers and disable them that way. And Rimrock's got telepathy, so things are already getting a little sci-fantasy here. And knowing nothing about the nature of the Ansels yet, it says of Rimrock the Ansel of that most gentle species had nevertheless slicers 3 feet long. And I don't know what other people think, but from my understanding, these slicers are part of his seal-like, walrus-like, large mouth and sort of tusks, in that form or shape that he takes, because we'll eventually see that he's a shapeshifter. But for now, we don't know any of that. We're just getting this impression of we don't know what. And it does set up something about his character all throughout, being of this gentle species, yet nevertheless it's having monstrous qualities. And that'll be important to various things about the novel, but especially about him and his species and so on. And this sort of action-adventure segment closes with this intriguing statement. The battle will have to explain itself as it goes along, for it is not over. It is to be fought again and again in its variations. Which is really intriguing, and I don't think I've traced out this idea in my readings of the novel yet, so I'm curious to see how that plays out too. So Paul narrowly escapes, and he's got all this blood loss, and gets into the ship and takes off. And this is where we get introduced to Hop equation space. That's HOPP equation space, which is presumably named after the mathematician or physicist or whoever who came up with this equation that somehow enables some form of hyperspace travel, I guess. I'm still curious what other readers think of that. Is this hyperspace or something else? But where it would normally take 5 years to travel by spacecraft from Astrobe to Earth, it can be done in a month through Hop equation space. But just at the mention of Hop equation space, when it says that Paul's like whistling as he entered Hop equation space, very importantly to the novel, it says, "It breaks here. It isn't like other space. And persons and things in it aren't the same persons and things they were before." Beautiful. It breaks here. It's going to be different. And it kind of signals not only what's happening in Hop equation space, but the rest of the novel. You are now in, if you hadn't noticed already, a different kind of science fiction novel. And Lafferty can do some really concise, standard sci-fi imagery to play along with these tropes. I mean, I think he's always kind of transcending and sometimes intentionally subverting the whole SF genre and so on. But he's good at playing the game in his way. And especially in this novel, maybe more than anything else he wrote, if you are a fan of science fiction as such, this is probably the Lafferty novel for you. And it's as close as he gets to really, really playing that game according to the rules. Though, it's very unruly. But I think he tickles that part of your brain that likes SF here and there throughout this novel. So while I would like it regardless of that, and I'm getting all kinds of things out of it, whether that has to do with science fiction or speculative fiction or not. Also, the part of me that really likes science fiction as such gets a lot out of this novel that way. So as it makes this jump, as we often call it, into something like hyperspace, it says, Paul's craft would disappear as it traversed the parsec and a half to Earth. But to the pilot who made the run, it was the rest of the universe that disappeared. To him, there was no motion, no worlds or stars, really no sense of duration or of time in passage. And I think that's pretty cool. I like that. It's effective. And from there, it gets weird. And here's where we get various physical reversals, like right-handed people becoming left-handed, and a reversal of gender or sex. I don't think it says quite specifically, but clearly male becomes female in the case of these characters in some sense. That allows them to, for example, like with Paul, it says he always sings soprano. It's the only time he could sing soprano is when he's in hop equation space. And this will be a great thing to discuss and see what other people think. There's so many little rabbit trails in this novel that I always thought were just for fun, and I like them that way. But I more and more, like the amount of them that seem to serve no real purpose to the novel just decreases and decreases to the point now where I'm starting to wonder if there is nothing Lafferty wrote in this novel that doesn't contribute intentionally and consciously to its sort of plots and themes. And this is one of those remaining things that I haven't, I don't know, this reversal, especially of gender or sex. Does that really play into what's going on in this novel? Or is it just like a funny thing? Here's a funny thing that happens in hyperspace. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But most importantly, there's this whole dream aspect to this kind of space travel. But basically, there's this statement that the law of conservation of psychic totality will not be abridged. There were 4.5 years of psychic awareness to be compressed into 1 month, and it forced its compression into these intense and rapid dreams. And I don't think it ever explains why, but Paul is only allowed, I think, to sleep 90 seconds at a time. And it says he became really adept at taking these cat naps. And each time he has dreams. So these 90-second dreams, thousands of them in this month. And it describes how they range around between gentle and horrific. And it goes on to talk about like this mental quality to outer space, which I presume somewhere somebody else has done this kind of stuff in science fiction, but I can't recall really seeing it anywhere. But as he puts it, there is a great lot of psychic space debris, and when one enters its area on hop equation flight, one experiences it. Every poignant thing that ever happened, every comic or horrifying or exalting episode that ever took place is still drifting somewhere in space. One runs into fragments and concentrations of billions of minds there. It is never lost. It is only spread out thin. And that is just so cool. And it is kind of one of those things he doesn't seem to do much more with in the novel, except these dreams and experiences that Paul and Thomas later have, but doesn't explore the idea more generally, but I think is one of those things that he puts in place for us to play with. And, I could, obviously be inspiration for other authors to explore that, but also just for us to think about and discuss. But it definitely does signal to us that this is a novel as much about inner space as outer space. And I think J.G. Ballard is famous for saying that he wanted to explore inner space rather than outer space. And Lafferty is kind of doing both. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. And it basically goes on to say that during this passage, Paul dreams of a lot of other characters in the novel that we've started to see and that we're going to see. And you get little pictures of them. And some of them are kind of intense. But he goes on to say, but it wasn't all heavy, vital stuff encountered in the passage dreams. Some of it was light and vital stuff. Also, still drifting in deep space is every tall tale ever told. Hey, here's one. I love that. So good. But, he basically says it's all vital stuff, but there's like heavy and light versions of that. And that's, again, speaks to Lafferty's whole mode that you're, even when he's being comic, it's still vital. It's getting to deep things. But we've already been given this idea that there's all this like mental debris out in space, but also, hey, there's a bunch of tall tales out there, or every tall tale ever is in space. What does that even mean? And Lafferty being Lafferty, I love this, just follows through on it. Hey, here's one. And boom, for a couple pages, we get an exquisite little Laffertian tall tale. And it involves a recurring character that appears in a bunch of Lafferty's short stories, and indeed comes in again, I believe, in Space Shanty, the novel. But he's called John Sourwine, or Sour John. He's given both names. And I can't wait to get into this when we go through the chapter in a video. But it's back on Earth, and because of Sour John's lifestyle, eating and drinking habits, his kidney becomes vitrified and is like green and glassy. And he decides to swap his own kidney with the eye of an idol, as the book calls it, in a city in Pakistan, I believe. John Sourwine climbs the statue and trades his kidney for the eye, and then sells the eye and makes a bunch of money and so on. And then they think that a miracle has happened and the eye has changed its substance to something even better than it was before, and its valuation goes up. And he concludes by saying, man, I think I lost out on the deal. And I definitely used to think this was just a straight up rabbit trail for fun, and really worked well as such. Like, it is kind of important that the novel even seems to do that, even when we find more meaning to it, that it seems to veer off, I think, is one of its important points, that utopia doesn't work because it doesn't allow for enough veer off points and things that don't fit. And so the novel formally embodies its own point in that way. But I will say this has become more and more on my radar as like, wait a minute, I think this is kind of an allegory of what the novel's about. So we'll talk about that later. And as it finishes that story, it says 20,000 of such little dreams. Hey, here's another one. And it launches into another one. And this one is, I don't know, less of a tall tale in a way. I mean, no, it's more like a myth almost, but a very raucous one. It is sort of, it's like a cosmic tall tale. And just an awesome little image of these sort of twin stars that are connected together by an actual chain that this little creature is hacksawing. A small green creature with the body of a monkey and the head of a gargoyle, it says. And Paul is in his dream realizing that if this creature cuts through that chain, it's going to make the entire universe, the entire cosmos collapse and become nothing. And he's trying to catch it in time, and he doesn't. And the whole universe collapses and becomes nothing. And like Fabian Foreman's voice comes into it, and he's like, I meant for you to be too late. And this one holds your hand a little bit and shows how it relates to the novel's plot and theme, though you still don't fully grasp what's happening there yet. But there had been this space captain in the dream urging Paul to get there in time to stop this creature. And when he doesn't, he goes, the universe had eaten itself and was gone forever. I told you to hurry, the space captain told Paul furiously as he came barreling up. Then the space captain's face melted like wax and he was gone. I did hurry, Paul said. Then his own face melted like wax and he was gone also. So yeah, the idea of sheer nothingness, like ultimate nothingness, ultimate annihilation, is very central to this novel. And so after these two little side stories, it says 90 seconds long, 20,000 of them, each one so different. Oddly, it is only the maladjusted who are able to stand the passages. The well-adjusted pilot cracks up on such a solo trip. That is why all hop equation pilots are of a peculiar breed. And this was a little detail I had completely forgotten that was brought out in the review by Literally Books. So that's something I love about having discussions about Lafferty's work, is there's so much to remember, and we can collectively remember and discuss it better than individually. But yeah, you have to be a little mentally unbalanced to even do this kind of space flight, which is such a cool idea as well. And again, speaks directly to the novel's themes about ideas of perfection and how perfection would actually be stultifying and not allow as much and enable as much in terms of possibility and realization and so on as imperfection. And this section concludes, nearly 5 years of psychic experience must be crowded into 1 month. The psychic mass of experience is not foreshortened. And so in a sense, this segment is kind of over and done before you know it, but it really leaves an impression on your mind and resonates throughout the rest. Okay, so from here, he arrives at Earth, and again, like I said, Lafferty does these little token things of science fiction. He talks about planetfall first on Earth and how it's blue, and then planetfall later on Astrobe and how it's golden, and they're really nice little touches that give me that kind of space opera type feel. And I'm curious to see what other people think about those kind of touches and details. But Paul goes to London and gets the appropriate coinage for the time that he wants to travel back to in London, does the time travel. It's just really quick, but it's a nice little touch too. meets up with Thomas More. They have a pretty cool conversation, and there's a few details about the tavern and different things in this segment that are nicely realized. I think it's a good little bit of historical fiction, and we get our strongest character really of the novel, Thomas More. He comes in at this point and just really starts, chewing scenery. And to Paul's surprise, Thomas was like, yeah, I've met time travelers before, and I've heard a bit about what's going on with my utopia in the future, which is a funny, odd approach. And Thomas doesn't entirely see the point of it, but agrees to go back with Paul to Astrobe. And Thomas, in his conversations with Paul, does say one of his key phrases in the novel where he says that, Paul, there is something very slack about a future that will take a biting satire for a vapid dream. And that's Lafferty's Thomas More, and not necessarily Thomas More from history, or as scholars have understood Thomas More. There's a lot of questions there and room for ambivalences and so on that we'll get into. But I think just for pure fictional purposes, Lafferty portrays Thomas More in this specific way that I don't think he's really that bothered whether it connects to history or not. Though at the same time, I do think it's probably, by and large, Lafferty's opinion that Utopia is actually a satire. And if not that it should be taken as one. And so once they're back in the present, they travel by hop equation flight back to Astrobe, and it briefly describes that Thomas experiences this whole rapid, dense, dreaming scenario, and that he too encounters some of the characters that he's about to meet in these dreams, sort of precognitively. And it says an important statement here, and let me just say that Lafferty does this actually a lot in his fiction, but he often will say in this novel, the Thomas and the Paul, and I can't remember if he does it with a few other characters as well. He puts this definite article in front of names a lot, and I think he gets that and a good handful of other strange grammatical things that he does throughout his fiction from his reading of other languages. He read something like 8 other languages, mostly European, but a few others as well. And I think there's things that those languages do with various grammatical constructions and so on that he likes to just like port over into English from time to time. I think just to spice things up, really. But knowing him, he probably also thought it was somehow important semantically or something. But anyway, in this quote, he says, "These dreams sank down into the cellar of the Thomas mind, but they would come up to him again when he met those persons." And that is something that literally happens as he discusses things with a handful of the characters. It will say, and now a passage dream came back to Thomas. And then it will come up for like a paragraph of nice description. And in the same way you got these 2 tall tales from Paul's experience, you get some of that like dream story experience from the perspective of Thomas. But instead of hearing about it when it happened in hop equation travel or hyperspace, it like is lingering and carrying over into his waking life on Astrobe, which is a very cool effect. And because sometimes I think the novel gets a little stopped up in its long dialogues, though they are super interesting and they do so much work and they're part of what makes the novel so substantial. Though I think they get a little stopped up, this is one of the ways that they get punctuated with really vivid stuff. It's cool imagery and also does a different kind of work that's more at the psychological and mythical level. Start, shooting start,